our transit-oriented communities policy, or TOC policy. So I'm going to present on that today. And then my background is actually in housing policy and land use. We have a small housing and land use team. If people are familiar with some of the nuances of regional governance, there's the Association of Bay Area Governments and MTC have merged. So we have one staff. And so people are more on the ABAG side of things. It's more land use policy. But I've learned about transportation policy a bit from my work on this topic. And yeah, happy to be here today. So I'm going to focus mainly on how the TOC policy impacts Bay Area cities, our progress on implementation, and then also some barriers we've experienced in realizing the policy's goals. Let's see. Oops, 1 second. There we go. So specifically, I want to walk through some background on the TOC policy and then dive a little bit into its different components and policy requirements, and then give an update on where we're at with implementation, as well as discuss some implementation challenges and our next steps. So for some broader context for those who aren't familiar, the MTC is the region's metropolitan planning organization, which means that MTC does the transportation planning, financing, and coordinating across the 9-county Bay Area region. And then our work is guided by Plan Bay Area 2050, which is the regional transportation plan for our area. And this long-range plan focuses on housing, the economy, the environment, and transportation. So for some background on the TOC policy, it was adopted a little over 2 years ago in September 2022, and its purpose is to support the region's transit investments by promoting places that center housing, jobs, and services around transit, and specifically that's the half mile around existing and planned stations that are served by rail, light rail, bus rapid transit, and ferries. And there are currently about 65 jurisdictions and nearly 400 station areas that are subject to the TOC policy. And one of the key aspects of TOC policy implementation is that MTC will likely consider TOC policy compliance when it is prioritizing investments in the next round of our One Bay Area grant program. And that's also known as the OBAG program. And the OBAG program is MTC's framework for programming our federal highway formula funds. And the main purpose of the OBAG program is to leverage these flexible funds to advance Plan Bay Area. And since these are pretty flexible funds, we're able to use them for investments that support regional priorities and local needs. And it funds a really wide range of projects such as bike and ped improvements, road repair, and land use planning efforts. And the OBAG program was first adopted in 2012. We're currently in the third cycle, also known as OBAG 3. And so we're aligning the TOC policy with the next cycle, OBAG 4. So we currently have been telling local jurisdictions that they should anticipate demonstrating compliance prior to the adoption of OBAG 4, which is anticipated to be in 2026. So the OBAG 4 program is currently being developed. And so remaining competitive for those OBAG 4 funds is currently the main incentive for achieving TOC policy compliance. Since these are those flexible funds that support a wide range of projects, it's a pretty desirable funding source for our local communities. So for some overview on the policy, it focuses on core elements that align with the implementation of Plan Bay Area 2050. And so those are land use density, affordable housing, parking management, and complete streets and multimodal access to transit stations. And so like many strategies of Plan Bay Area, this is really a long-term effort. We're anticipating the TOC policy would be fully implemented over several OBAG cycles, and this beginning of the OBAG 4 cycle in 2026 is our first chance to assess compliance and see where folks are at with meeting the goals of this policy. So as noted on the previous slide, the TOC policy has 4 primary components. And so those are density, housing policy, parking, and station access. And each component contains specific standards that a jurisdiction needs to meet to achieve compliance. And the number of standards varies a bit across these 4 policy areas. And notably, the density and parking requirements vary based on the type and level of transit. So generally speaking, Tier 1 is areas that are served by more robust and frequent transit, and so we expect higher density and less parking in those areas, and that ranges down to Tier 4, which is generally our more infrequent commuter rail service. So first, the density requirements. The TOC policy establishes minimum thresholds for both minimum and maximum densities for new residential and office development. And then these standards vary based on the transit tier that I covered on the previous slide. And the way these thresholds are defined is it's based on an average of the densities across parcels in that half-mile station area. And the reason this is done as an average is that allows for, instead of it being a pure threshold for every parcel, this allows for some variation based on constraints and varying conditions. Yeah.
I'm curious, why is there a maximum limit or density?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's the maximum is optional. This is the way to view this as a minimum maximum. So the way zoning typically works is that jurisdictions set a maximum density. What's much less common is this minimum density. And so what these standards are saying is that, if you're a tier 1 station area, most places have not implemented minimum densities. You find them in San Francisco, I think in Berkeley, they're starting to do this, in parts of Oakland, but it's not super common. But so in these tier 1 areas, projects would need to come in at least 100 dwelling units per acre. And then if you do have a maximum density, it needs to be at least 150, but it could be above that. So it's like a minimum threshold for the maximum density, if that makes sense. Yeah, so we're not requiring maximum density. Though even places that don't have a maximum density per se generally are limiting development in some way through something like a height limit. There's usually some way that development intensity is being restricted. But thanks for the question. And so one other thing is that the TOC policy, it doesn't require folks to zone for particular uses. So we're not saying you need to zone for residential, you need to zone for office. But if there is residential and office or commercial zoning within these station areas, these are the intensities and densities you need to be meeting. And one other nuance of the policy is that jurisdictions are allowed to exclude parcels that have existing housing on them from these calculations. And the thinking there is that upzoning increases land value. And so we didn't want to contribute to displacement risk by encouraging upzoning of existing housing units and making those parcels more attractive for development and incentivizing getting rid of existing tenants if it is rental housing. So next, we also want to encourage equitable development near transit. And so the TOC policy requires jurisdictions to adopt 2 policies across each of 3 housing policy topic areas. And those are affordable housing production, affordable housing preservation, and tenant protections. In the housing policy space, these are referred to as the 3 Ps, which people might be familiar with. But those of us who work in affordable housing, that's a really common term. We talk about the 3 Ps of affordable housing. And there also needs to be one policy for commercial stabilization. So that is to prevent the displacement of existing small businesses. And so some examples of these 3 Ps policies, production policies are policies that increase the supply of affordable housing. So that's something like affordable housing funding or streamlining the development process. Preservation is maintaining the affordability of existing units where lower income people live. So those are policies like an ordinance that prevents the closure of a mobile home park. And then protection policies help keep lower income residents where they're at and prevent their displacement. So that's something like rental assistance or funding tenant legal services. And then for each of these topic areas, there's a menu of policy options. So local jurisdictions can choose what best meets their local conditions. And then for parking, the first requirement is that jurisdictions cannot have a minimum parking requirement in most of the transit tiers, which people might be familiar. AB 2097 state law got rid of parking minimums, so folks kind of automatically comply with that standard, which is good. And then we're also requiring folks to implement parking maximums. So similar to our density minimums, this is also kind of a cutting edge space. Jurisdictions typically don't have parking maximums. You do again see this in some cities like San Francisco and Berkeley. But this is an area where we're really kind of pushing folks past the status quo. And then additionally, there's also a requirement to have at least one secure bike parking space in new housing developments, one per new housing unit, and then in new office development, one per 5,000 square feet of office space. And then there's some additional policy changes people need to make. So they need to allow unbundled parking, which means that the cost of a parking space is separate from the cost of a housing unit. So in a new rental development, you're not requiring someone to pay for a parking space if they don't want to. And then shared parking, which is requiring folks to allow shared parking between land uses. So in some cities, they might say, in this development, we're requiring this number of parking spaces for the office and this number for the residential. And so that results in more parking. So we're saying you need to at least allow a development to do shared parking. And then lastly, we have an additional menu of 5 policy options that have to do with parking management and TDM. And so folks need to choose one from there. And our final component is the station access. And so these are things folks need to do to improve station access and circulation. And so MTC has a complete streets policy, which I must admit I'm not deeply familiar with, but folks need to adopt policies and guidelines that comply with that. And then also prioritize implementation of our active transportation network in the active transportation plan. And then there's a requirement to complete an access gap analysis that focuses on improving 10 to 15-minute access to and from these TOC areas by bike, ped, and transit. And lastly, identifying opportunities for mobility hub planning and implementation. And mobility hubs are places in a community where there's a lot of public transit, bike share, car share, other ways for people to get around without a private vehicle. And so lastly, I want to cover our implementation to date, talk about some challenges, and then happy to take questions. So in terms of our implementation to date, over the past 2.5 years, we've done a lot of really in-depth engagement with stakeholders. So that's over 200 meetings, including over 120 meetings, one-on-one with local jurisdiction staff. We had at least 2 rounds of meetings with the 60 plus jurisdictions that are subject to the policy. And these meetings were primarily with housing and planning staff, since a lot of the requirements are around housing policies and changing land use. But we're also encouraging folks to bring along their public works and transportation staff, since those folks will be implementing the parking and the station access. And also those are the departments that typically receive these OBAG funds. So it's important for them to be aware of the policy. And then last year we released administrative guidance. Since it's a really broad sweeping policy, we needed to do a lot of thinking about how we would provide more detail around all of these different policy requirements and the nuances, and then also provide folks information how they can submit documentation to demonstrate compliance. And then to support that effort, we developed an online portal where people can submit this documentation to us, and that's especially useful for the density component since that's so spatial. We developed a mapping feature where folks can assign parcels to different densities, and it does this average density calculation. And then we have been providing ongoing support to jurisdiction staff since there's 60 plus jurisdictions subject to the policy. Folks have a lot of questions, and so we're there to provide technical assistance and help people achieve compliance. So we've been doing things like developing template ordinances people can use for the housing policies, or reviewing people's zoning to see where their densities are at, and then just answering a lot of questions. And most recently, we also released some funding to support people with TOC policy compliance. So we did a round of grants that support planning across all 4 policy components. And then in our work to date, implementing this sweeping policy effort, we've learned a lot. We've also encountered some challenges. So with a policy this broad being applied to so many cities across a very large region, there have been a lot of details to figure out, and new questions come up all the time. So for example, as I noted, the density requirement is based on an average density, which isn't really like a common thing. That's not really how you do zoning. And so we need to figure out how you would calculate this average density and provide guidance to jurisdictions on that. And every jurisdiction in the Bay Area does their zoning a little bit differently. When you start to dig into zoning codes, it varies, which is part of the reason why it's so hard to build things. And so that also was difficult, how to communicate this one standard to so many people when everyone does things a little different. Another nuance was the policy says that it applies to both existing and planned stations. And as folks know, planned stations exist across a wide spectrum. We have things like Link 21 that's very conceptual, and then stations that are under construction. So we need to figure out at what point is the station planned enough that this policy applies. And another common challenge with regional policy making is we have a very large region and a really diverse range of jurisdictions. This policy applies to rural Sonoma County jurisdictions with smart stations. It applies to San Francisco and Oakland. And so it's hard to figure out how to account for all of these nuances across this diversity of jurisdictions. And so for example, as I mentioned there, the level of transit service tiers was one way to try to get at this to differentiate our parking and density requirements. But even within those transit service tiers, we have those are pretty broad. So for example, the tier 2 applies to BART stations served by more than 2 lines, which is most BART stations. And so that contains a really broad range of urban and suburban geographies. And as folks probably know, a lot of suburban BART stations are in areas that are very difficult to navigate by transit or bike and ped. And the parking requirements for tier 2 are less than one less than one parking space per housing unit. And so even if you live next to a BART station in some of these suburban areas, it could be very hard to get around without a car. If you work and live near BART stations, you can get to work, but you might not be able to do other things for daily life. So unfortunately, in a lot of these places, there is still really the need for cars. And so that tier 2 might not really be capturing those nuances. A tier 2 station in Berkeley looks a lot different from a tier 2 station in Fremont, for example. And then along those lines, there's a very forward-thinking policy, and we've been trying to thread the needle between this transit-oriented future we want to see and then our current market realities and land use patterns. So, for example, jurisdictions have expressed concern that the parking requirements could kill housing development because lenders and investors want to see parking in projects that's otherwise they get nervous. And similarly, as I mentioned, even if they were on board, some of these the parking requirements don't totally align with the realities of how people get around the region. Unfortunately, there's a lot more that needs to happen besides just building development with less parking, and this policy can't address everything. And then another big issue has been staff capacity. A lot of jurisdictions are under-resourced and lack staff, and this policy is very complicated and requires a lot of effort to comply with. And there's also some equity considerations there. The folks with the least staff and the least capacity and the most difficulty complying, if their access to OBAG funding is reduced, those are probably the jurisdictions that already face some of the most structural challenges. And also, it's been a huge effort for us at MTC. There's kind of a team of 3 of us that do all the implementation for this policy, and it's a lot to figure out and a lot of jurisdictions to work with. So it's just required a lot of time and resources. Another big challenge has just been the complexity of documenting compliance. As I noted, there's so many requirements, and then particularly these density requirements, as I talked about, thinking about all the different local zoning codes, how we figure out these averages, just a lot to think through. And so that was part of the motivation behind developing our online portal, and that was also an immense technical effort. Another thing we've encountered, since this is kind of a broad policy that covers housing, land use, parking, public works, in jurisdictions, these departments are often very siloed. So trying to communicate across all those different areas to get folks to work together to achieve compliance. And lastly, one of the main challenges has been trying to figure out where we draw the line on pushing for implementation, meeting these standards, but also ensuring we maintain support among MTC policymakers who are local elected officials. And there's been a desire folks have expressed for more flexible policy standards, feeling like the way the standards are currently doesn't really fit with local jurisdiction contexts. And so based on our work to date, we're now starting to figure out some scoring metrics to determine compliance and think about how we might incorporate some level of flexibility in terms of how compliance is assessed. So one example of this is, maybe there's some sort of like partial credit where a jurisdiction doesn't fully meet the minimum density, they're not at the 50 DUA or whatever it is, but maybe they do 40 DUA. Maybe we give a partial credit towards compliance, and then in the next round of OBAG, hold them to a higher standard since this is a progressive policy. That's just one idea that hasn't been decided on completely, but that's some of the ways we're thinking about how can we be flexible as we roll this out, especially this first round. So just lastly, kind of our next steps going forward over the course of the next year, we're going to continue to offer local staff support with working towards compliance and submitting their documentation to us. And then the OBAG 4 program is currently being developed, so we'll be coordinating with partner agencies. And it's that development of OBAG 4 that will really finalize how we score compliance, set a final deadline for compliance in 2026, and then determine how TOC policy compliance will impact access to those OBAG 4 funds. And so our discussions over the next year with policymakers will help us define whatever flexibility we do offer with the policy compliance requirements, and then think about how the policy will impact funding decisions. So the OBAG 4 is expected to be developed or adopted in the beginning of 2026. And so our compliance deadline would be shortly thereafter. Then there'd be a call for projects, and then the project selection is anticipated to be in 2027. So that's when we would see how compliance impacts OBAG 4 funding. So we kind of have sort of a year for jurisdictions to continue to work towards compliance, anticipating a deadline early next year, and then seeing how this all shakes out with funding in early 2027. So that's the end of my presentation, and happy to take any questions that people have. Thank you. Yes.
My question is for the OBAG 4 projects.
Yeah, so the OBAG program is really broad, so it funds a wide variety of things, and it's there's both a regional program that MTC funds, and then there are county programs where MTC gives money to the county transportation authorities across the 9-county Bay Area, but those county programs still have some of the same conditions on them as the regional program. So TOC policy compliance would apply to both. And OBAG funds a really wide range of things. It funds like road repair, bike ped improvements. It also funds, at MTC, we have something called priority development areas that local jurisdictions can self-nominate. And then you can get a priority development area grant. And so that's essentially to do a specific plan to do land use planning. It also helps pay for staff costs. They're very flexible funds, so that's part of the reason they're very desirable, because they fund a really wide range of projects across the region.
So if you have a county that has jurisdiction non-compliant, that might jeopardize the ability of the county to actually be able to funding it for a countywide program.
The county would still have its funds, but that project might not be awarded funding. And the specifics of that will be developed as OBAG 4 is developed. But a non-compliant jurisdiction might be less competitive for funding.
You mentioned how you didn't want to upzone some existing properties for fear of displacement. How would those essentially minimum density requirements affect a area that's already really developed, built out, like downtown Palo Alto?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so what would happen? So it's at the jurisdiction's discretion, kind of which parcels to exclude in the calculation. But if they wanted to exclude all of the already built out parcels, that means any parcels that were vacant, or, it might be a parcel with commercial property on it, but it's zoned mixed use. So you could build housing there. So any of those parcels, that few remaining kind of set of parcels, would all probably need to meet or exceed the standard, since your average is being calculated on a very small subset of parcels.
Questions, can you please project? People on the call are having trouble hearing your questions. Thank you.
The microphone's up there.
Yes.
Okay.
I could repeat them, I guess, too. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks, Eli. Very nice presentation. You've obviously done a lot of work and probably done this a bunch of times. But how's the reception? How many jurisdictions are involved? How many projects are involved? Are you getting a good reception?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was about kind of reception of the policy. I would say, so when we first started out, I think folks were less engaged, and that was 2.5 years ago. So that's why a big part of our early efforts were just raising awareness that this was coming. And I will say we've kind of been pleasantly surprised that people are taking this pretty seriously. I think part of that is kind of the incentive of those OBAG 4 funds. And so people are pretty engaged. It does vary. Some jurisdictions we've heard from very little. In some jurisdictions, haven't ever received OBAG funding, like a smaller jurisdiction. So it does vary. So that's less of an incentive to comply. But I would say most of the 60 jurisdictions that this applies to are working towards compliance in one aspect or another. And we are kind of actively in touch with them. I do think there were some kind of timing issues with the rollout of people might be familiar with the housing element process that happens every 8 years. And so a lot of jurisdictions already did their housing element rezoning. And so if they already rezoned and they met our state requirements for a compliant housing element, but maybe it wasn't at a high enough rezoning to meet these TOC requirements, it'd be really difficult to go back and rezone, and the community would be upset. You have to go through CEQA. So there are some challenges there. And so those kind of things, impacted the reception among local staff. As I said, many jurisdictions are already kind of overtaxed and under-resourced in terms of their burdens for their planning departments. And so, to have MTC come in and have yet another project for them to do, that creates some tension. But I would say overall it's been, positive that folks are taking this seriously. We are offering a lot of assistance, and so they've been receptive for that. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
How much has MTC and your group gotten into recent discussions on changes in funding and how that works now? Because there's a lot from the federal level on down to the states and to the MPOs, and using words like, inclusion, diversity, affordable, and so on. Suddenly, what we thought were all really good things, suddenly, do we have to just change the nomenclature, or does OBAG still get funded the same way? How much does that come into your work at this point, or has it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We have a whole separate funding team that does the OBAG program, and so I'm not as involved in that directly. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty at the federal environment. I think, currently we're kind of proceeding as we have been. And we have a team at MTC really closely tracking kind of what's coming down from the feds, but so far it hasn't directly impacted this work. And I think OBAG 4 is proceeding, kind of taking a look at OBAG 3 and building off of it, but not currently anticipating, any really sweeping changes. But it's hard to say what the future holds in that space. Yeah.
I was wondering, how and if you've thought about making the reporting easier as it may be a challenge for small jurisdictions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one thing we've offered is with the density. So we've for jurisdictions for higher capacity jurisdictions that have like GIS capabilities, they could kind of do this on their own. They don't necessarily need to use our portal, but there are a lot of cities that don't have those abilities. And so for them, especially those cities often don't have that many TOC areas. So we've gone in and reviewed their zoning codes and kind of entered in the data for them. We kind of reached out and asked if they wanted that help. And then the portal we created will then do those average density calculations for them. So they don't need to have GIS capabilities. And then the other requirements, the reporting isn't as difficult. It's more kind of compiling documents and answering some questions. So our main effort there with our portal is just kind of to streamline all of that, make everything in one place. I think it'll still be a bit of a lift, but we are hoping to kind of minimize the burdens on local staff there.
I was curious about your coordination, how much translation fees were involved, and how was it mostly with local agencies and no work with transit agencies? We try to look at their concerns or needs or vision.
Yeah, and the question was about coordination with transit agencies. That must have been so I don't know if I mentioned this, but I wasn't involved in the development of this policy. So I was some of my transportation colleagues that developed, and then in 2022, and it was passed, our housing and land use team took it over for implementation. So I'm not sure. I assume the transportation agencies were at the table. I've definitely worked with BART staff a little bit on their TOD team. Since people might be familiar, I believe it's AB 2923 is state law that gives BART some for BART owned parcels, it kind of removes some of the local jurisdiction land use authority and implements certain zoning standards. And so it's a somewhat similar effort to this. So I've coordinated with them a little bit on the BART stations. But otherwise, my work is mostly with the local jurisdictions who will be implementing this, since they're the ones who do have the land use authority and the ability to make these changes. Yes.
As you go through the different iterations of the OBAG grant funding, are there any revisions that get done to the TOC policy itself, or more just about compliance for the iteration of it?
That's a good question. I think that's, to be seen, since this is the first time we're rolling this out. I think the intent is to keep the policy standards the same, and that it would be more about how we measure compliance, might change over time, and that gets a little bit stricter, but not wanting to water down those standards themselves. Ultimately, that is up to MTC decision makers, so the folks who sit on the committees and the commission, which is mostly local jurisdiction elected officials. So there is always the possibility, they might want to open up the policy and change it. But the current intent is for the policy standards to maintain over time, maybe be reviewed in the history, or sorry, revised in the future if there's good reason to do so. But generally speaking, just kind of looking at how we measure compliance and maybe raising the bar a bit as we move forward and folks have more time. Yeah.
Presentation. Regarding the funding, it was going to be seen as both resiliency and other things, like there's an intersection of the locations that you have kind of identified and where other types of projects are needed. Would it play into the scoring of the projects in terms of where they're located, and the resiliency projects or other projects to be incorporated into protecting that area around it?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's not really directly a part of this policy. Yeah, that wouldn't impact scoring. I mean, there's a lot in kind of Plan Bay area more broadly around resiliency and in kind of the local planning efforts we assist jurisdictions with. So presumably, if they were doing some of the land use planning and rezoning, they would also, and some things like hardening or sea level rise, needed to be taken into account. And I would hope that those efforts would be coordinated, but that isn't directly impacting this policy and compliance with this policy.
To compliance, I was wondering, how much do you expect jurisdictions to apply? Because I know there are a few that probably aren't going to choose to comply with this.
Yeah.
What would the MTC's response for that be? For funding? Would it just be, okay, great, the other jurisdictions that do follow this, they get more funding? Or are you gonna essentially try to sit down and negotiate with them of how much compliance can we get?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that's kind of the main thing we're working to figure out currently as the OBAG 4 program is developed. There's been a high level initial proposal was presented at the MTC Programming and Allocations Committee earlier this month. And so kind of the current sort of broad conceptual framework is that there would be sort of like a spectrum of compliance. So there'd be kind of non-compliant jurisdictions who make essentially no or very little progress, kind of a broad middle category of substantially compliant folks, which we do expect because people really do seem to be working on this. And then a smaller group who are fully compliant, because acknowledging these standards really are a pretty high bar and they're very different from the status quo in most places. So it is unlikely that many jurisdictions will fully reach the standards in the policy as written. And then where one sits along that compliance spectrum might impact access to funds. So the current proposal was that non-compliant category would be able to get sort of limited funding that helps with TOC policy compliance. So some things OBAG funds around like these land use planning efforts to achieve these higher densities. And then the middle category would have access to most funds. And then to incentivize that full compliance, there might be like a funding set aside for the fully compliant jurisdiction. So if you were fully compliant and there was an OBAG project, the odds that it got funded would be very high. But again, that's kind of an initial proposal and the details are to be worked out and that'll ultimately be voted on by MPC decision makers.
Few questions from the chat.
Uh-huh.
So Linda, is there a component of aligning schedules and locations for transit service? For example, my husband and I both worked for the state of California, but both retired early because of our work schedules. Because the work schedules were changed so that we could no longer use a van pool in my case. And in my husband's case, his time away from home each day increased by 1.5 hours if he continued to commute by bus.
What's the question?
Is there a component of aligning schedules and locations with transit service?
I guess so the TOC policy isn't really about the transit service itself. I think so the reason the TOC policy focuses on rail and ferries and BRT is the thinking is that that's really permanent infrastructure generally, and that's also more expensive infrastructure to build. So if the region is investing a lot of money, especially in rail, new rail stations, that we want the land use in the areas around these rail stations to be supportive of transit ridership. And so that's why people might be familiar with major transit stops, which are a framework under state law that encompass all these other TOC things, but they also encompass high frequency bus routes. But as discussed in the question, schedules often change. And so that's why our TOC policy isn't about service frequency. It takes frequency into account a little bit with those transit service tiers, but whether or not something is a TOC is more based on the type of transit. So it's about this fixed guideway transit, this really permanent transportation infrastructure and focusing on the land use around those areas. Oh, no problem.
For driving cars. This is primarily to raise the awareness of businesses, government personnel, etc., and to a lesser degree for the information of people needing to reach a location.
Yeah, I think, things like if that's talking about, kind of like wayfinding, are really important. That's not as directly, I don't think that's one of the station access components. It might be kind of like a subcomponent of some of the ways one might get at some of the station access requirements. But MTC, I'm not as directly involved in this, but I can share a little bit, has been involved in a big wayfinding effort. We have a new section, regional network management, which is trying to do some of this really important work. We have 20-something transit agencies across the region, try to do better coordination around schedules and fares, and also have more of a unified system for wayfinding. So I don't know if folks have heard about, but it was recently launched at, I think, El Cerrito del Norte, BART, and then somewhere in Santa Rosa, this pilot program to show what a more universal system of wayfinding for Bay Area transit might look like. So I think you can go online and take a look at what some of the signage and mapping that's proposed looks like. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks everyone for your questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Nice to meet you. What's your name?
I don't.
Hey. Are you working on the downtown plan? Oh, cool. I managed the grant for that, but I haven't been very involved today.